and I'll be letting people in as we go. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for attending today. My name is Steve Jerch. I am the Director of the Center for Policy and Practice here at the Association of Community College Trustees. I would ask just a couple housekeeping things. If you wouldn't mind putting your name and institution into the chat so we can get an idea of where everyone is coming from. And then also, if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat. Depending on how much time we have left, we'll do some question and answers. But if you put them in the chat, if we don't get a chance to answer them today during the webinar, we can always answer them post event and then share out the answers with the group. So with that being said, today we're here to talk about digital equity. And so digital equity is an issue that has quickly moved to the forefront, particularly during COVID. The gaps around things like access and adoption became very clear when everything suddenly moved to a more virtual setting. With the investment from the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that was passed earlier, we have a historic opportunity to narrow the digital divide and advance digital equity in the US. In fact, I don't know if you heard this today, but President Biden is kicking off his tour to discuss the law by announcing a more than $42 billion investment in expanding high-speed internet and other investments in digital infrastructure. The U.S. Department of Education's Office of Educational Technology is well positioned to support efforts like this to advance digital equity, particularly with regard to human-level adoption barriers. So what I'd like to do is introduce, we have several speakers here with us today. So I'd like to introduce Ji-Soo Song and Jessica Chung. They're both from the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Education Technology. They're going to be taking us through a presentation on digital equity, the infrastructure law, and what higher education's role is when it comes to digital equity. And then a little later, we'll be hearing from Amanda Winters. She is the program director in the Center for Best Practices at the National Governors Association when we engage our panel on this topic. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ji-Soo and Jessica for their presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us here today. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Chung. I am a fellow at the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Educational Technology. I'm going to share a few slides with you all. Just want to make sure that you all are able to see my slides. Great. Awesome. So again, my name is Jessica Chung from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Educational Technology. I'm joined today by my colleague, Ji-Soo Song. I'm going to pause and let him introduce himself too.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everyone. I'm Ji-Soo Song, Digital Equity Advisor from the Office of Ed Tech at the U.S. Department of Education. Yeah, great to be here. And Steve, like you mentioned, I think this is a really timely topic to be talking about. In addition to his Investing in American tour, the president announced more than $42 billion in broadband funding this morning, going out to states from the federal BEAD program, right, which is related to the digital equity program that we'll be talking about today. So really exciting times for broadband and digital equity and inclusion all around. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Back to you, Jessica.
Awesome. So for those of you who are not familiar with our office, the Office of Educational Technology establishes the vision for how technology can be used to transform teaching and learning. We're best known perhaps for issuing the National Educational Technology Plan, which often becomes the basis for local and state educational technology plans. The NETP, as it's known, is currently undergoing a refresh with the goal of publishing by early 2024, so stay tuned for that. As for today's presentation, we would like to provide some policy context regarding the digital equity planning processes that are underway in every state. We would also like to review findings from our Advancing Digital Equity for All guidance resource, which discusses community-based strategies for helping learners access digital opportunities. We also want to highlight examples of the role that higher education leaders can play in advocating for digital equity, and share resources and key steps for leaders to get involved. So ultimately, we hope that this presentation helps you consider how you can contribute to state digital equity plans and ensure the needs and the assets of the education sector, especially community colleges, are included in those plans. So first, to provide some policy context, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed in fall 2021, includes $65 billion in broadband investments. And we have an opportunity through this funding to make home access to broadband and digital opportunities equitably and sustainably available at scale. This funding includes the Digital Equity Act programs, which are administered by the Department of Commerce and in particular the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA. And this program will fund several programs, including the development of state digital equity plans, which is going on now. So all states and several territories have already received their digital equity planning funds. Many states received their funds in November or December 2022, and they have a year from the date they received their planning funds to complete their plans. So many states are hit the ground running or in the midst of their outreach processes or their drafting processes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. As for what the digital equity planning grants require, they require state digital equity plans to include things like the identification of digital equity barriers, measurable objectives related to digital equity, an assessment of how these objectives will impact and interact with economic and workforce development, educational outcomes, health outcomes, civic and social engagement, and the delivery of other essential services. NTIA also requires states to consider the needs of covered populations, which are listed on the slide. So that includes lower income populations or lower income households, aging individuals, incarcerated individuals, veterans, individuals with disabilities, individuals with a language barrier, individuals who are members of a racial or ethnic minority group, and individuals who reside in a rural area. So as you can see, learners are not included in the list of covered populations. However, learners and their families and caregivers overlap with every covered population listed. And as you probably are well aware, a lot of these populations that are listed are populations that are very well served by community colleges. And so OET sees a necessity for state digital equity plans to address the needs and the assets of the education sector in order to close the digital divide. And community colleges can play such an important role in that effort. And so with this background in mind, and knowing that the Department of Education is not the lead federal agency on this program, and that we're not administering any of the funds from the bipartisan infrastructure law, some of the central questions we've asked ourselves are, what is the Department of Education's role in maximizing the impact of that $65 billion broadband package in the bipartisan infrastructure law, especially as state leaders develop plans for spending these funds? We also ask ourselves, how can we increase access for learners, families, caregivers, educators, and communities that are the furthest from digital opportunities? And we urge you all to consider, what role can you play in ensuring that state digital equity plans address the needs and assets of the education sector? So to support state broadband and education leaders with their digital equity planning and ensure that the benefits of these historic investments reach learner communities, OET launched the Digital Equity Education Roundtables Initiative last fall, otherwise known as the DEAR Initiative. And this initiative aimed to identify barriers to broadband and technology access for learners and to suggest promising strategies for leaders as they develop digital equity plans. The initiative particularly focused on learner communities furthest from digital opportunities, such as learners of color, Indigenous learners, learners in rural areas, learners in digitally redlined urban areas, and learners with disabilities. And you can access more information on that initiative at tech.ed.gov/DEER. And so as a result of this initiative, we developed a publication informed by a series of learner-centered listening sessions called Advancing Digital Equity for All. And so we're very excited to be able to share this resource with you, to share this resource with the field and with broadband leaders as well. This resource is available at tech.ed.gov/DEER, or you can also scan the QR code to access the resource. And so in developing the resource, we found through our scan of the literature on digital equity in education and through our listening sessions that access is comprised of three critical elements. We call them the 3 A's of availability, affordability, and adoption. And this is the framework that organizes the resource as well. So we argue that for equitable access to happen, we need to ensure that all three aspects are addressed. We need to address availability, making sure that the physical infrastructure is in place to enable access to internet services in a given area. We need to address affordability, or households' ability to pay the total cost of subscribing to and maintaining internet access and access to technology tools. We also need to address adoption. And adoption refers to some of those human level elements that can either enable or impede access, such as access to information, access to technical support, access to digital skills and literacy opportunities. Adoption can also refer to things like public trust and relationships that can support communities in partaking in programs and services. And so while our federal colleagues at the Federal Communications Commission and NTIA tackle some of those issues related to availability and affordability, we see an opportunity for the Department of Education to really drive the conversation around adoption, emphasizing the needs and the assets of the education sector and taking a human approach to digital equity. So given their experiences navigating the pandemic, education leaders have invaluable experience in supporting the adoption of technology tools for learning. Education communities have developed and implemented adoption strategies such as co-creating solutions with communities, providing inclusive, accessible, multilingual, multimodal technical support, providing digital literacy and skill building opportunities and fostering that digital resilience, leveraging trusted community assets. Oftentimes, education institutions are trusted hubs of information in their communities and are able to leverage their position as a community anchor institution, as well as mobilize their communities to provide information and technical support to their surrounding communities. And educational institutions also know how to collect data, how to participate in regular learning and feedback cycles that are so important for evaluating what's working and what's not working. And so we know from the DEAR initiative that higher education and adult education learners experience unique barriers to accessing technology-empowered opportunities, such as assumptions about digital literacy and skills and a need for technical support and training for learners and for faculty. And we also know that the most impactful solutions are those that are co-designed with learners and built to be accessible. So we must ensure that community college learners and their families, educators, and organizations are included in these state digital equity planning processes to help identify those barriers and propose solutions that will work. We've been working to collect and publish examples of education institutions, communities, and organizations implementing strategies like the ones described on the slide on our story engine. So you can access that on the link on the slide, and there will be more to come in the next few months as well. So we wanted to provide a few examples of states that we've talked to who are partnering, who have built those partnerships between higher education and state digital equity planners, whether it's conducting research, whether it's facilitating community engagement. All of these states show what role higher education can play in these processes and the assets they bring to these processes. So for example, Colorado and Indiana have both leveraged the adult education sector in their digital equity planning processes. Colorado's Office of the Future of Work, which historically has led adult education for the state, is leading their digital equity planning process. And in Indiana, the State Adult Education Office has helped with data collection, community engagement, and asset mapping. In Illinois, The Illinois Broadband Lab is leading their state digital equity planning processes, and that lab is a collaborative effort between the State Broadband Office, the University of Illinois, the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society. And they are leading town hall meetings, small group listening sessions, webinars, information sessions, workshops, and other opportunities for the public to provide input, leveraging the strengths of all of those different organizations. Louisiana, one of the first states to receive their planning funds. In Louisiana, the Board of Regents that oversees the state higher education institutions has been a critical partner for the state in ongoing digital equity planning efforts. For example, the Blanco Public Policy Center at the University of Louisiana has been leading community engagement and partnering with local institutions in all regions of the state to conduct public outreach opportunities. In Washington State, the Washington State University Extension has been collaborating with the State Broadband Office to facilitate county-level broadband action teams. This has been really important in a state where there are many rural communities that the State University Extension system has reached into. So I think that's another great example of how higher education is making sure that state digital equity planners are reaching some of those covered populations. So in this case, folks residing in rural areas. And so with that, I will pass the mic to Jisoo for more action steps and resources.
Thanks, Jessica. So I know that was a lot of information. So I think the bottom line question that many of you might be asking yourselves is, how can education leaders like yourselves contribute to all of these ongoing national digital equity efforts? And from what I'm seeing in the chat, it seems like some of you have already been deeply involved. So first of all, thank you so much for that. And I'd love to hear from you on what the collaboration has been like with your state's digital equity planners. But moving away from the topic of digital equity plans for just one moment, we'd love to talk a little about the Affordable Connectivity Program because it's so closely tied with all the digital equity discussions underway. As trusted hubs of information, like Jessica mentioned, our community colleges can really be a driving factor in promoting the Affordable Connectivity Program to eligible students and households. Basic information about the program, if you haven't heard already, it's a $30 per month benefit to help with internet access for eligible households. When it comes to higher education, we know that all Pell Grant recipients are eligible for it. So in early 2022, the Department of Ed actually published a Dear COG letter detailing how higher ed institutions, community colleges can leverage things like FAFSA data to increase awareness of public benefits like the Affordable Connectivity Program with eligible students and households. And we also have a toolkit on tech.ed.gov/ACP that's a little geared towards K-12 schools, but a lot of it can be adapted towards higher ed facing needs as well. So feel free to take a look at that. We also recently partnered with the White House and an organization called Civic Nation to launch a campaign called the Online for All campaign, which the president actually gave us a shout out during his morning announcements today, which was unexpected, but really deeply appreciated. That campaign has a goal to promote broadband access, affordability, and equity, and the ACP is a big part of it. You can find out more information about the campaign and the ways that your institutions can contribute at onlineforall.org. There are some really great outreach resources that we're continuing to aggregate on that page. And earlier this month, we engaged in a national week of action, mobilizing more than 300 organizations to help communities get enrolled. And some of you may have been involved in that as well. But it's certainly not too late to join the cause even after the week of action. We're actually thinking about sort of a back to school kind of campaign as well. So please continue to help us share the information about the Affordable Connectivity Program with the educators you work with the learners and their families that you work with, and the communities that you are involved with as well. So coming back to the digital equity plans after that little bit of a detour. So we really encourage you to reflect on the barriers and the strategies that are included in the guidance resource, Advancing Digital Equity for All, that Jessica talked about. How do those barriers, resonate with the barriers that you've seen in your own communities, and the strategies that we were able to identify through our national digital equity listening sessions? Are those some of the strategies that you've also found to be promising in your own communities? Second, if you haven't already, keep up to speed on the stakeholder engagement efforts announced by your state's broadband offices and share information about those opportunities with the education sectors. We know that, a lot of states are still holding those, statewide listening tours, which might visit your local area. And we actually published a blog on our Medium with a list of states that have announced or will soon announce those engagement efforts. So feel free to check out that blog as well. Again, if you haven't found out already, a great resource, a great contact that you should keep in mind are your state's federal program officer assigned by NTIA, as well as the state broadband office contact. And you can find their contact information by looking at NTIA's Internet for All map, which we've linked on the page here. So after you found out who those folks are, consider reaching out to them if you haven't already, and offer your support and expertise on this topic. Also, state broadband offices, those federal programs officers, can be a really good point of contact to learn about the efforts that are already underway in your states to develop the digital equity plans. And then reaching out to them, carefully consider things like, what's the specific value add that your input can provide? From talking with different states, they need help in, compiling some of the relevant data to identify the gaps that they see in their states, engaging with those covered populations that Jessica talked about, identifying promising practices out of tens of thousands of solutions that are out there, and maybe how could you eventually position yourself as a partner for the state in implementing some of those digital equity plans, right? And check with your points of contact at the state level, maybe the state higher education offices or the SEAs, to see if they've already successfully quote unquote grabbed a seat at the planning table, and discuss how you can best support their efforts if they're already underway. And then certainly last but not least, digital equity plans are required to undergo a 30-day public comment period. And when those are announced, consider participating in that to further advocate for the needs of learners who are furthest from opportunities. NTIA recently released a new resource, a new page to keep track of which states have made their digital equity plans available for public comment. We know states like Louisiana and Maine have already opened theirs up for public comment. So consider participating in that. And we know more states will be announcing those public comment periods throughout the summer. So encourage you to sign up for their newsletter that you can access there. So we shared a lot of links, a lot of resources. It's listed on this slide, and we'll be sure to share this slide with you through Steve so that you have access to all of these links as well. All right, so just to conclude, we return to that central question that Jessica asked at the top of the presentation. What role could you play in ensuring that those state digital equity plans engage with the needs and also the assets of the education sector and the community college sector as well? How can OET support you with this work? We're happy to answer any questions, and we look forward to collaborating with you all to advance digital equity for all of our learners. I'll drop our office's email address in the chat if you want to get in touch with us, and yeah, let us know how you're collaborating with your digital equity planners.
Well, thank you both Jisoo and Jessica for that great information. And it is always, I guess, these large federal initiatives are quite complicated, as you can see, but I think this subject is quite complicated as well. And it's just so much more than give everyone broadband and give everyone a laptop and everyone should be fine. It's that adoption piece that I think gets lost in the shuffle so much. And that's really where higher education can fill that gap. I know I was at a college during COVID, and we switched everything, as many of you did, overnight from in-person to online, and it was just a scramble to get even highly educated faculty members used to this online environment. So I think being involved in these state initiatives is going to really make a difference for your institution and for your students. So what I'd like to move into now is some questions for our panelists around this subject. And the first one is for Jessica and Jisoo. You guys talked about a lot about how higher education's role in this digital equity in your presentation. So you mentioned what role could higher ed play, but I think it would also help to understand, what would you say the 3 biggest challenges you see in digital equity in higher education right now? And either one of you can take the lead on this question.
Yeah, we've received this question from a lot of different folks. And what I kind of like to do is sort of reframe it as three different opportunities, three biggest opportunities. And we mentioned some of them throughout the presentation, but to really underline them. First, the Affordable Connectivity Program right now, it's the big challenge to enrollment right now is simply awareness and understanding of what the program entails. Folks like the Benton Institute have done some national surveys, and over 50% of qualifying households don't even know that the ACP exists as a benefit for them. So that is a big flag for us. And sometimes the vice president's office emails me and says, hey, the vice president actually talked to this community college leader from this state, and that leader didn't even know that the ACP was a thing. What can education do to make sure that the ACP, the word about the ACP is getting out to these hard to reach locations? So really appreciate your help in, really building on that opportunity to close that understanding gap because community colleges, serve so many eligible populations right now. The second opportunity, as Jessica and I tried to underline, was those digital equity plans. We realized that unless there's those deliberate collaborations between folks who often don't get to talk to one another, the digital equity planners, the state broadband offices, and the education sector, we sort of worried that the needs of learners might fall to the wayside, in those digital equity plans. And our community college sector has so much to, offer when it comes to, building that bridge between sectors, ensuring that learners are included in digital equity plans, and again, positioning themselves as implementation partners once states receive their digital equity implementation dollars from NTIA. And then addressing those human level challenges, those adoption challenges. This is where community colleges, we know, really excel, right? We had a chance to talk with, during our National Digital Equity Summit, a leader from Quinsigamond Community College from Massachusetts, and he talked about how they're hiring, student advisors who are, building digital literacy skills among their students, connecting students with affordable internet programs to make sure that they have the resources that they need to connect with and succeed in online environments. So, these are the types of assets that the community college can really, focus on and deliver to the digital equity planning process. So really want you all to sort of think on those opportunities. Yeah.
Would you have anything to add around like how the state higher education leaders could use this policy window? Because this is not something that happens on a regular basis with these large investments like this. Any advice on how the higher ed leaders in the states can use this policy window to address those challenges?
Yeah, so I think it really starts with building, relationships with the right folks, right? Again, if you go on internetforall.gov, you're able to find out who your state's key leaders are, right? The federal programs officer who serves as a glue between different agencies, as well as the state broadband office director, right? We're happy to make those introductions with any of those folks because we've made some good contacts in every state that we've been able to talk to, and they've been really open with connecting with folks in the education sector. So if you need help in connecting with them, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to make those intros to the right folks. And you can do that yourself by checking out the map on internetforall.gov. And another opportunity I mentioned is towards the end of my slides is to make sure that you contribute to that 30-day public comment period process, which again, states like Louisiana and Maine have already announced, and Utah, I think, already announced it, but it will continue to roll out on a continuing basis over the summer. So keep an eye out for that.
So thank you for that. That's extremely helpful information. But I wanted to touch on one thing you mentioned in your presentation. You talked about how, granted, this is like higher ed can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And you specifically honed in on how community colleges are anchor institutions in their community. So I'm wondering if, and obviously our audience is community college based. So I'm wondering if you could expand specifically for community colleges, what they could do right now to help with digital equity, but then at the same time, who do they need to engage with to stay involved?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So as we mentioned in the presentation as well, the education sector, they already have a lot of that expertise and experience in getting people connected and advancing digital equity for their learners, for their communities. And so I would say education has the experience and the trusted relationships to lead or assist with data collection, mobilizing communities to contribute their input to state digital equity plans. They also have the experience and trusted relationships to implement some of those digital inclusion strategies, such as supporting ACP enrollment and providing digital literacy training opportunities. And as you underscored, like when we look at the list of covered populations, we see so many of the learner populations that community colleges serve. For example, in some rural areas, community colleges might be one of the few community anchor institutions. So I think community colleges can sort of take that equity-centered, that sort of equity lens when it comes to approaching digital equity, given the relationships they have with those covered populations. In addition, as you and Jisoo mentioned, the president this morning announced the release of that BEAD funding, of that enormous investment in infrastructure. And this is less related to the digital equity plans, but we have heard from a lot of states that they're interested in developing the workforce that will be needed to build that infrastructure, and that they want to leverage their in-state workforces to build that infrastructure to expand broadband access. And I think community colleges are also really well positioned to help develop this workforce, and they have the experience and the expertise to develop this workforce. So that is, I think, another area where community colleges can be really, really impactful and can leverage the work that they've already been doing. There are more examples of what community colleges can do at the institutional level, and I'll drop another link in the chat. And this is from the Connecting Minority Communities program, which is an NTIA program focused on expanding high-speed internet access and connectivity to eligible HBCUs, tribal colleges or universities, and minority-serving institutions. So just to highlight a couple of them, Cabrillo College in California is using funds from that program to expand broadband access and improve the educational experience of some of their Latinx and low-income students. So their project includes purchasing accessibility software to support their teaching and learning center, hiring adjunct faculty to support digital literacy training and to teach courses on digital literacy, partnering with K-12 schools to connect students to dual enrollment courses and provide outreach and counseling. They're also hiring student assistants to connect students with digital literacy training and to become more familiar with technological resources in higher education. Another example from this program is the Wayne County Community College District in Michigan. Their project includes assembling a regional digital literacy and skilling consortium to build the capacity of digital skilling organizations and develop equitable adoption strategies. They're also implementing training programs to build digital skills and the IT workforce capacity in their surrounding communities. So those are a few ways that colleges, community colleges are participating in digital equity efforts.
No, that's a really good point. And also, there's also some Department of Labor initiatives right now around some training grants for these types of infrastructure jobs as well. So I'd like to actually bring Amanda into the conversation now. And we've heard a lot about how these federal funding initiatives are flowing through the states for obvious reasons. So I don't know, Amanda, could you share a little bit about what the planning process is, what that would look like for the distribution of these funds and specific to these digital equity initiatives?
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm mainly here to just talk about how important community colleges are to this whole ecosystem of work in states. And I'll give you a little bit of insight as to what we're hearing about some of this work. Governors are establishing digital equity leads in their states, as Jisoo had mentioned. And some of these folks sit in very different spaces within state government. And so there's a variety of approaches. Some are, so you have infrastructure leads, and it's hard to sort of parse some of this out too. Like you have Governors have also established infrastructure leads broadly to be thinking about a lot of the monies that are flowing from the broader infrastructure bill. And then digital equity specific work is living in a lot of different spaces. We have a state that is going through their state librarian's office. There's economic development agencies. There's the broadband or IT agencies that are taking some of the leads on some of these things. So it's very different perspectives in different states. And so your approaches will be different based upon sort of the voices that are leading some of these conversations in your state. But I will say we brought some folks together at the end of last year to talk about higher ed's role in digital equity. And there was a variety of approaches. And we've been trying to message these to governors' offices as they've been putting together their teams who are thinking specifically about how these monies are flowing. And I think there's a community college role in a lot of these different spaces. First of all, access. We certainly saw during COVID that anchor institutions such as community colleges were a hub for access. And we're great partners with the state as the state was trying to get more digital access to folks who needed it for jobs, for education, for healthcare reasons, all of that stuff. So I think we want to build on what we learned in COVID about some of the assets that exist, especially in some of our rural regions, as Jessica mentioned. Community colleges as anchor institutions and sort of the reach that they have into rural communities and how that can be an asset for the digital equity planning process at the state level. But I will just shine a light quickly on one of the things that came up in our meeting where I think there's opportunity to think about how you all could play a role, an active role. It's really around adoption. So there's going to be a lot of planning about, where to put fiber optic lines and, some people who need to get it out there in the broadband workforce, which is a place you guys can engage broadly in the infrastructure conversation. But adoption, when it comes to digital equity, so it's not just the basic skills, but also how are you going to get your communities to engage more actively with the resources that are available to them digitally, that are online, how they can use these resources to get better jobs, to get better access to healthcare and opportunities and resources. And we had some colleges that were trying to think really creatively about how their students could be assets within their communities to support adoption and understanding the community context for why people might have barriers to adoption. And people were thinking like, how could we have our work-based learning be people engaging with, say, you have an aging community. So people in your college getting out there in the community and supporting connections around adoption when it came to digital equity. So there's a lot of space there to be thinking specifically about your communities, the demographics, thinking in an asset mindset of how the students, the faculty, everything about your institutions are really there to serve your communities and have been for years. This is just a newer part of the conversation of serving the community. And I think one of the gaps we see is that a lot of governors' offices might not truly understand all of the assets that exist at some of these local areas. And so communicating up, here's what we can do, here's what we have, here's some of our ideas, how could we engage? Certainly, I think, Jessica, one of the things she highlighted was extension offices in states. A lot of people are thinking about, and you might have extension campuses from your community colleges that exist in some of the smaller areas that you're serving, and understanding how they can be assets and how they can be leveraged as training points, as access points, and again, as adoption points for your communities that might be a little bit more separated from some of the nexus points for investment or larger programming around digital equity in your state. I will also just throw out, and I'm rambling just a little bit here, Steve, so cut me off at any point that you need to. But I did want to point out specifically something you guys might already be thinking about, but one of the target populations for the Digital Equity Act is incarcerated individuals. So not the recently incarcerated, which the first time I read it, I was thinking, okay, we're thinking about reentry, but specifically incarcerated. And that has a great tie-in to Pell reinstatement, which is any time now. We're going to have full Pell reinstatement for incarcerated individuals. And as your institutions are thinking about, what you want to do or how you want to expand in that setting, now that Pell is back online for those populations, how can these investments strengthen the work that you want to do with these folks to help them better access training, education that's going to lead to successful reentry? This is a point where you can engage on sort of how can your plans for second chance Pell be accelerated through investments in technology and technology access and digital equity training for people in your incarcerated settings. So I just want to throw those out as a few things that we've been hearing from states about sort of creative ways for higher ed to jump in there and engage, and know that sometimes it's going to be a lot of technology people you're talking to. So coming with ideas, access points, and the assets in your specific community and the understanding of your specific community, which I think can really help to bring you to the right tables to make those connections about policy and programming and workforce connections in your specific regions.
Thanks, Amanda. So basically what I'm hearing you say is that community colleges are the best thing ever on this planet, and that
Just
we
the
should
best.
do everything. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So you did mention, just a quick follow-up, you did talk about like some of the planning process, like there's some things around like where the actual, either the infrastructure is going to be placed and located and those types of things. Do you see community colleges having a role in that piece, or is it more about just sort of bringing their resources to the table? And then if they want to get involved and they don't know how, like what's the best way a community college can say, okay, I want to get involved with this initiative, who do I talk to?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways that you can do it. I really do think governors are trying to streamline how this money is flowing through. Again, I think some lessons learned from COVID, where we had a bunch of money flowing into states and it was a bit of a Wild West in getting some of this money out and finding the right kind of programs to connect them to. I think governors are trying to be really thoughtful about having a lead who's understands the ecosystem, and then having the people underneath who are really thinking about sort of the local implications and dispersal of the funds. So I do think there's an opportunity to engage in the conversation around sort of where's the money going? Are there programs being developed that insight from community colleges could really inform? So I do think there's great opportunity there. But I do think, like Jisoo mentioned, figuring out who your lead in your state is around some of this work is a great starting point. Also, if you have relationships with your governor's office and you have some ideas, reaching out there. If you don't, but you would like to, I would love to put you in contact with the right person in your governor's office to have a conversation about how you want to engage and what opportunities there might be to think about your community college specifically as an asset, or community college sector as a whole, and where you think there might be great opportunities. So I will throw my email into the chat before we log off today. And if there's any connections that I can help you make in order to have that kind of conversation, be more than happy to do it. And I think Steve and I are planning to continue to work together over the next several months to try to make some clear connections between community college assets and state digital equity planning. So if you want to be part of that too, keep in touch with Steve so that we can pull you into further conversations. But those are a couple of different, if you want help reaching out, let me know. If not, certainly go ahead and reach out actively, proactively, and indicate the assets that you can bring to the table.
No, that's very helpful. And before we go, we'll have a few minutes for question and answer. But before we do that, I want to circle back to Jisoo and Jessica. And Amanda mentioned, obviously, she's neck deep in the states because that's who she works for. But you've mentioned that you had talked to some states around this. Can you share a little bit of feedback or responses that you've received? Like maybe it's around higher ed's role, maybe it's just around like what they're asking for from our sector.
Yeah, I'll sort of reflect on my conversations with states and just let you know about 3 things that we've heard. And Jessica, feel free to chime in with anything else that you've observed. First, I think I mentioned this, states, from everyone that we've been talking to, generally recognize that education and higher education, needs to be a big part of their digital equity discussions. And they've been open to collaboration with and networking with leaders. We've asked them, have you connected with your adult education leaders, your higher education leaders? And they're like, oh, we haven't. Who can you introduce us to? And we've been able to facilitate those, connections over the past several months. So we feel like they're generally open to that type of sort of cross-sector collaboration. Second, they recognize that there are already a lot of good solutions out there, right? So they're not trying to reinvent the wheel in a lot of cases. They're really trying to identify solutions that they can replicate, accelerate, and scale with their digital equity funding. So if you can help them identify where those good solutions already exist, I think that can be a really great asset for them. Third, states recognize that the digital equity program with its $2.75 billion in funding is much smaller than the BEAD funding, right? The physical infrastructure build out program. So they're really seeking partners that can help them create room for sustainability, right? What other resources does the state have that can sort of fold into and sort of braid and blend together to sort of support shared objectives, right? So those are the type of things that we've been hearing from states. Jessica, anything else that you've observed?
Yeah, a couple other things. So one I already mentioned earlier, the interest in workforce development and the need to develop a labor force that'll help with building out the infrastructure. And I think another thing that I recall hearing from a state is that the digital equity planning processes they're just the beginning. And I think it was Colorado, the Office of Future Work, they were saying how their planning partners are also going to be their implementation partners. And so I think that's another opportunity. It's that's another thing that community colleges and the community college sector can underscore as they're approaching states, is like the opportunity not just to partner in those planning processes, but also the strengths and assets community colleges can bring to implementing those digital inclusion strategies. One other thing that's a bit of a side note, I noticed that the Internet for All interactive map the link doesn't seem to be working at the moment. And that's where we had been directing folks to find their state contacts and broadband offices and their NTIA contacts. So I'm going to drop in the link instead, drop in the chat a different link. And this is to a resource that World Education has been developing, particularly with a focus on adult education, but they do list all of the different states and contacts and some of the public outreach efforts that are going on in each state. So just dropping that in the chat as another resource for you all to figure out who to get in touch with.
Thanks. That's that's a nice follow-up. And actually, so I know there's been about 400,000 links and different resources that have been shared. So I do want to put everyone at ease and let you know that I will be including all of this information in the follow-up along with the recording of this webinar. So you don't have to worry about, did I miss a link in the chat or any of that stuff? It'll all be sent out as a nice follow-up. So we do have a couple minutes if anyone has a question. I know there has been some activity in the chat, but I didn't know if anyone wanted to come off mute and ask a question. And seeing nobody come off mute, that is perfectly okay as well. So I just would like to say, thank you to our panelists for sharing their expertise and lifting up some of these strategies to bring back to your states to help implement this historic investment and work to bring about true digital equity. And so I want to also thank you, the attendees, for taking the time to be with us today. And I hope you have a great rest of the week, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Take care.